Isn't the reconciliation to defund Obamacare and Planned Parenthood really just political theater, given that Obama's going to veto it, certainly, and then are there votes to override that veto? Thank you.
I don't mind jumping in on that. Anytime that you make someone in elected office take a stance, it's extremely valuable because the American people don't watch too much till then. So he will absolutely say, I refuse to understand that you as Americans are hurting because of this bill, that you're losing your jobs. Some of you have been cut back to part-time, and that's playing out in my district extremely hardly. Many of you now have lost the insurance that you spent decades preparing for your family, and I, as the President of the United States, am going to tell you, forget it, I'm going to veto it. I think that's extraordinarily valuable in the political circumstances.
Well, I do too. Look, all the promises that we were told when this law passed, you like your plan, you can keep it, false. You like your doctor, you can keep it, false. Premiums are going to go down, false. Deductibles are going to go down, false. Average premium reduction will be $2,500, false. Website's going to work, false. Website is secure, false. Emergency room visits will decline, false. So everything they said, so Steve's exactly right. No one likes this thing because it's terrible. So this is the first time it gets to the president's desk, and he'll have to say, I still like a law that everyone knows was presented to the American people under, in a false way, in an untrue way. And so he'll have to, restate that position and affirm that he's still for it, not to mention what else is in the bill, which is an organization getting your tax dollars engaged in the most reprehensible kind of behavior shouldn't be getting your tax dollars. So I think it's, we'd prefer it be the law, but this is the first time it's going to get to the president's desk, and he's going to have to restate his position.
Other questions on reconciliation bill?
Hi, I'm Melissa Quinn with the Daily Signal. Going off of that, can you explain what this does in 2017 and also in the future in terms of the 50 votes needed to repeal Obamacare through reconciliation and not having to overcome that 60 vote threshold?
Looking ahead to 2017, I think we want to make absolutely clear that Republicans in Congress need to put together a plan to replace Obamacare. People are hurting. I didn't think it was possible, but it has made a bad system even worse. And it's incumbent upon Republicans to work to repeal Obamacare and replace it. So I'm excited to see the Speaker talking about putting together a replacement. I think this putting this on his desk is 5 years overdue for most Americans, especially those that have been hurt by this, have lost health care. The premiums have gone up, the deductibles have gone up, they've lost their health care plan, they've lost their doctor, and they don't see anybody in Washington doing anything about it. But we've voted dozens and dozens of times to repeal, and finally it'll make his desk. But now it's time to get to the hard work of setting the stage for actually fixing healthcare problems. We've got some great solutions. We know what the conservative solutions are. We just haven't passed them through the House, and they're certainly not in law. So I think this sets us up very well, not for the election, and that's part of it as well, but most importantly for making certain that the strongest country in the world has the strongest healthcare plan, healthcare system in the world that's based on free market principles, not something put out by a bunch of bureaucrats and politicians in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what my colleague just said, and one of the roles of the press that can be helpful. Sometimes up here the press is fascinated with a horse race between personalities and that kind of thing. But please go out and interview, take random samples, use your good name as objective reporters and journalists, and interview 10 or 100 small businesses and ask them, how's Obamacare working for you? And that's it. See what they say, and then please report that, because we don't think this is political. There are facts out there that can be ascertained by an inquiring press, and there are objective facts, and I hope you guys will actually go out and do that and encourage other journalists to do that, because that will inform the American people, if you report on it, what we're trying to do politically, and that, I think, will help the American people. Thank you.
Next question. We'll go in the very back here. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Lindsay McPherson with Roll Call. On the topic of Obamacare and actually getting to a replacement, the repeal and replace mantra has been something Republicans have talked about for years. Would you guys like the opportunity here in 2016 to have a floor vote on a replacement? That's something that's not been done. I know you guys haven't sent a repeal bill to Obama's desk, but you also haven't had a floor vote on a replacement. Is that something you'd like to see this year?
Let me very quickly address that, and I think that there's a premise in there that I think is false. If we repeal Obamacare, that doesn't mean there's not health care in America. Before we had Obamacare, America enjoyed the best health care in the world. People were coming to the United States of America to get the kind of treatments that we offered here at the prices that we offered them. And that tells you something about the quality of health care that we had pre-Obamacare. Now, Obamacare has been mentioned by some of my colleagues, has deteriorated what was the best health care system in the world. So let's be clear, if we repeal Obamacare, the very first thing that happens is we go back to the best health care system in the world, based primarily on free enterprise principles, based primarily on a patient-doctor relationship. There are some things we can do to improve the best health care in the world, and I think that's where we collectively want to come from. But I reject the premise that the mere repeal of Obamacare somehow or another results in a system that is not there. When we had health care 6 years ago, and it was the best, and that's where I want to go as a starter.
I would also add to that and I agree with Mr. Brooks, but also I think that you'll see some of the conservatives who were really frictional with leadership during the last 3 or 4 years because we were not putting our plan forward. Those plans had been developed, but that's part of the friction that had developed between just the members and leadership who would not do that. I think you're going to see the replacement pieces coming forward, but again, I would rest all those comments on the premise that Mr. Brooks made that we did have the best health care system in the world.
All right, let's come up here to the front.
Hi, I'm Katie Watson. I'm a reporter with the Daily Caller News Foundation. We just came out with a story this morning discussing how only 13% of top VA officials at medical facilities across the country are actually veterans. And I would love to get the opinion from some of you, especially those of you who have served, but really all of you who care about veterans, which I would assume would be all of you, as to why that could be problematic. If that is even in some way a little bit of an outrage that so few veterans are helping run these facilities, and how these medical facilities could better serve our veterans if they were actually run by veterans.
Well, I know I just spoke, but I'm also one of the few veterans in Congress, and I will tell you that it's offensive watching the VA and the way they deal with our veterans. It's as if they're an obstacle rather than needing solutions. And so one of the things that we take on, square up, and we will go in and sit down with our regional directors, with the state directors, and make them answer the questions for the veterans. We'll have 15 or 20 veterans there, and when they have that public accountability, suddenly the service starts improving, but it's an accountability that I, as a member, push directly at the VA. Many times it's just attitudinal. Appointments canceled, and in our state, New Mexico, you can drive 6 and 7 hours to get to your appointment. Oh, we canceled that a couple of days ago, sort of flippant-like. So it's attitudinal as much as anything. But having veterans in the service would improve greatly, because you just get a sense of what you've all been through, and having people who never went through the system is obscene.
I would just add, though, this may be a case of a story in search of a problem, in that I don't know what the crosstabs would look like, but for instance, I was a HSC officer in the Air Force Reserves for 8 years. If you look at the actual percentage of military personnel that are on the healthcare side, it's relatively slight. So the idea of, you wouldn't necessarily want to have a lot of infantrymen running the veteran system. You would certainly want to have an input there. You'd want to have a perspective there. But in terms of the day-to-day management on the healthcare side, I would suspect that it's probably reflective of the overall crosstab that you see if you looked at military personnel and the number of folks that have had healthcare experience.
I would say, as a physician and a former military officer, I've worked in veterans hospitals. I'm going to agree with Mr. Sanford. I knew plenty of people at the VA who were not veterans whose missions were to serve veterans, and that was their public service. And I looked at them, it's the way I did my fellow officers in the military. I mean, they were serving veterans in that case, not active duty personnel, but that was their measure of public service. So I would not use that as a yardstick, whether or not you've been a veteran. Being a veteran doesn't qualify you in any special way to take care of veterans above and beyond those dedicated individuals, many of whom are in the VA, but clearly not all of the people in the VA whose main interest is taking care of veterans.
Serving on the VA committee, what I think we need at the VA, and one thing I think is important to recall, the current situation is not the worst the VA can do. It's probably the best they can do under the current circumstances. We need two things. We need competence and accountability, and we need choice. The third part, we need choice for folks that live in rural areas like Representative Pierce and myself, our constituents. But when you have 2 employees that have been on paid leave for 600 plus days, I don't think that's changed in the last couple of days. 600 days of paid leave, there's no accountability. And we just learned this morning that dozens, perhaps thousands of breaches of veterans' privacy. This has nothing to do with the status of those that are working there. It's the lack of accountability. Folks need to lose their job. I think the case was reported this morning of a VA employee, whether she was a veteran or not, had gone in and looked at her ex-husband's private medical records over 100 times. Lose your job. You don't wait 600 days. And we have passed the VA Accountability Act through here, and I think it's a good sign that the VA doesn't want it. They don't want accountability. And they continue to hide and protect incompetent individuals. They should lose. That should start now. And I think that would bring radical changes to a system desperately in need of it.
All right, we'll come up here to the front. We'll do this first question, then we'll come.
Well, I'll tell you, Dr. Murphy's bill is a good bill. The mental health system in the United States is broken, doesn't work, and he has some very innovative ideas in that bill that would go a long way towards solving the problems, not eliminating the problems, but solving the problems with the delivery of mental health care. The problem with the president's approach yesterday was let's just throw more money at it. Doesn't work. Doesn't work in the VA system. We threw more money at it. We didn't solve any problems. It won't work in the mental health system. There are structural problems with SAMHSA and other aspects of the mental health system that can't be solved with just more money. It needs fundamental reform in how mental health care is delivered in the country and the role of the federal government in that delivery. And to answer your question about prospects, I would hope that we'll move something in the House. I would hope the president, doesn't just want this to be a soapbox issue and actually wants to solve a problem. And if he does, he should encourage the Democrats to get on board with Mr. Murphy's bill and to move it through Congress and to begin to solve the mental health delivery issue we have in the United States.
John?
Thank you, Genevieve. I would like to ask the panel, we are seeing this, what would appear to be a demonization of Republicans in the last few days. First, through the executive order on guns the other day. Second, through the identification with the Bundy brothers in Oregon and their father, who was not involved at all in the Speaker of the Wildlife Preserve. Do you see the same thing, an election year demonization of Republicans over Second Amendment issues, and how do you combat something like that?
Let me just briefly, look, I couldn't agree with you more. Anyone who watched the president yesterday had to be struck by the unbelievably partisan nature of his remarks. It's not like he wanted us to solve this problem as Americans. He wanted to solve it as Democrats versus Republicans, which is the wrong way to approach this issue. But I will tell you fundamentally, The president has, and I hope that all my colleagues point out the fact, the president's had a chance to fix the NICS system for years. I asked Mr. Holder in a appropriations subcommittee hearing, point blank, pardon the expression, 2 years ago, about why in 2010, 72,000 applications, background checks applications were denied, and there were a total of 44 prosecutions. Now, this is tens of thousands of convicted felons or fugitives, over 10,000 fugitives who lied on a federal form in order to get a firearm, and of that number, 44 were prosecuted. 13 found guilty, 12 were pending as of the time of the report. So less than 30 individuals out of 72,000 were prosecuted by this president's Justice Department. If the president wants background checks to work, then prosecute the people who lie on a federal background check form and who will go out and lie again because the federal government under Attorney General Holder and now under the new Attorney General, Ms. Lynch, are not prosecuting these crimes. This is what we have to talk about. The background check system is broken. Being a representative from Maryland, let me extend it a little further. We have an extensive background check system in Maryland. In fact, it's a 7-day waiting period with a much more lengthy background check. And yet Baltimore has just completed a year with the highest per capita murder rate in its history, mostly with gun violence. Background checks don't solve the problem. They don't solve it in Maryland. They don't solve it in Chicago. They didn't solve it in Washington, D.C. And for the president to put up this straw man in an election year goes to exactly the point of your question. This is an election year straw man issue put up by a president whose Justice Department isn't enforcing current background check law.
If I could add something. The way I handle it when the Democrats try to demonize me for the positions I take is I call them compliments. When they say that I'm trying to protect the Second Amendment, I say damn straight. That is exactly what I'm trying to do, because the Second Amendment is the bedrock amendment that enables the American people to be sure that they will never be subject to the kind of dictatorships that have occurred in so many other places around the planet after the citizenry was first stripped of the ability, the weaponry, needed to defend themselves against an oppressive government. But let's talk about crime for a moment. And I'm going to make a statement which at first most of y'all probably will say, where in the world is he coming from? The number one cause of gun violence in the United States of America is that the President of the United States is not securing our borders. Now, what do I mean by that? It's this. Throwing out for a moment the illegal aliens that come into our country and use those guns to commit violence. Throwing that out for a moment. Think of the individuals who are committing gun crimes in America. Normally, they're related to other kinds of turf wars. It might be gang turf wars. It might be drug turf wars. Why are so many Americans having to resort to criminal activity in order to make a living in the United States of America? They are having to resort to that criminal activity because they can't find good paying jobs. There's not the hope that this president promised for them in America. There is the despair that this president is giving them in America because we have so many illegal aliens who are coming into our country and taking jobs, particularly those in the blue-collar trades, and suppressing wages such that so many Americans now, particularly our youth, they're despondent, they're looking for some way to survive in our economy, and they resort to criminal activity, and they resort to guns, and they resort to killing people. So if we were to correct the border security issue, if we were to remove the illegal aliens here, taking roughly 8 to 9 to 10 million job opportunities for American citizens today, one, we would give those people who are despondent and resorting to crime to survive an opportunity to legally make a living, and two, because you will have decreased the artificial surge in the labor supply, almost all wages, if not all wages, at the lower income blue collar levels would increase, thus making a legal way of making a living more attractive. So if you look at the despondent people in Baltimore and the riots associated there, or if you look in Missouri with the discord that was there, understand the economic basis of it and understand the interplay between that economic basis and this president's refusal to protect American jobs for American people.
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces on the demonization of Republicans, but the fundamental underlying piece that's in all the press over the last months, and there's some research by Princeton economists on this, is this new anger and anxiety across the country. It's not partisan. It's sweeping across the country, primarily through the middle class. There's all sorts of sociologists and economists who will report on that. And so what Mo Brooks is getting at is this anxiety is at its all-time high. In the face of that anxiety, President Obama wants to double down and increase the size and scope of the federal government, which is creating the very anxiety that is the problem. And on top of that, on a moral level, liberals have always had a more optimistic view of human nature. And if they want big federal government to work, then everyone has to work together in harmony, right, and have a kumbaya moment. For that to occur, it would be better if the president wasn't demonizing the opposition. And so the very liberal order, the very liberal utopian order he wants and needs for a large federal government to work, he is undercutting by demonizing the other side. And I think the American people, I think there's a wave, it's bipartisan, of folks who want solutions to what Representative Brooks was getting at. Solving the causes of the anxiety are economic. Median family income is down $2,400, right? The average, the middle family, right? You can do the distribution of income and go Bernie Sanders, but the average median, the middle family, their income is down $2,400 a year over the last 8-year cycle that corresponds with President Obama's policies. On foreign policy, we have crises around the world. We have no systematic coordinated policy from China to Russia to Syria, Iran shooting missiles at us in the Straits of Hormuz. And then what Mo was getting at in terms of domestic terror, there's 1,000 open cases across 50 states on the homeland, according to our FBI director. We didn't do anything on the budget on visa waivers, visa overstays. The southern border is wide open. You got the refugee crises. We had a veto-proof bill that we passed through the House, not included in the budget. So all this anxiety, failure of President Obama's policies, and so you can kind of see why he turns to the political card of demonization because his policies are not working.
I represent a 34% Republican district. I represent 2 non-Republicans for every Republican, and I will tell you that the anger among the American people at the lack of job opportunities, at the fear that they're just not going to be able to protect themselves and that the government won't protect them, the discomfort and the pain caused by the Obamacare, those are bipartisan fears and angers. So when the president is trying to stir up discontent towards Republicans, understand there are many Democrats who are angry about the things that he is trying to stir up. And so that sword is going to cut both ways.
Let me just interject one question here. We have a question to Congressman Labrador. Hello, Happy New Year. This is from a Jay Howell, who's with KBOI in Boise, who wanted to ask on this whole question of frustration to get your reaction to what's gone on out in Oregon, the sentencing of the Hammonds, which many are calling double jeopardy, and just in general, the federal control of so much land in the West and the frustration that seems to be as a backdrop.
Well, the issue in the West that people here in the East don't understand is that we have, in Idaho, it's over 65% of our lands are owned by the federal government. It's the same thing in most of the states in the West. And what we have is frustration where you have the BLM, you have other federal agencies that keep taking over the lands. If you look at what happened to the Hammonds, even the judge said that they should not be sentenced to a 5-year sentence for their actions, that their actions may have been illegal, negligently illegal, but that they shouldn't be going to prison for 5 years. He even found that under the 8th Amendment, they should not be subject to a 5-year sentence. But the Ninth Circuit disagreed. It's one of the few times that the Ninth Circuit apparently doesn't agree in granting more rights to people that are being sentenced, which is a really odd thing. And it's one of the reasons that I actually have embarked in sentencing reform. When you have a case like this, where, and some of my friends here disagree with me, but this is the prototypical case where a judge would have been able to make a decision that was just and fair, as opposed to having the sentencing guidelines say that you must go to prison for 5 years for a particular crime. And so you have all the frustration happening with the takeover of the lands by the federal government, with an unjust sentence, and you have just the frustration that they feel the federal government is not listening to them anymore. And that's what leads to what so far has been a peaceful takeover of an abandoned building, by the way. And I think the media, is so quick to sort of cast aspersions on that group of people. But you'll have a person in the middle of a crowded field yell Allahu Akbar and actually shoot at people, and the media says, wait a second. We should not make any judgments here. But these people have what they've done so far, and hopefully they will continue to do it in a peaceful way. They're trying to express their frustrations, and I think civil disobedience has been something that, for the most part, the liberal media used to stand up for. But apparently there's some exceptions to that, and that's when conservatives and pro-Second Amendment people are trying to exercise that same right of civil disobedience. So it's pretty frustrating. But I hope my colleagues that are not from the West can understand what's happening in the West, where there's such a level of frustration with the federal government. And for the most part, the federal agents out there are good people. They're trying to do their job, but they're constrained by the laws and by the regulations, and they live out there with us, and they understand that these laws are making it more difficult for us to actually enjoy the fruits of our labor and to enjoy our freedoms out in the West.
As the other Westerner, I'm talking way too much, I apologize, but the Hammonds were accused of burning, and they were convicted of burning 130 or 170 acres of federal land. Now, keep in mind, we in the West are watching the backfires that were set exactly the way they set. The backfires are burning 300,000 acres when the agency sets them. They're burning 255 houses in my district in one 30,000-acre fire. And so you get people put in jail for 5 years for burning 130 acres that they were given permission. It looks like they were given permission to set the fire. And the agency can burn 300,000 acres and nobody is accountable. The Gold King mine spill, the EPA just went in and released water that dumped tons of heavy metals into our streams in New Mexico that flowed down from Colorado. Not one accountability for that, and you put somebody in jail for 5 years. That's the reason people in the West are furious. They're furious going into this situation. Now, I'm not taking a side on the Bundys. I think that's a sideshow. I think the Hammonds are the ones who have been badly treated, and that's what we're expressing in the West. We're fed up.
Thank you, Congressman.
I just want to agree with Raúl on this. I've co-sponsored a lot of sentencing reform as well as he has, and I want to point out that if this escalates, if this doesn't turn out well for anybody, that we have the power to fix it in Congress. The problem is the Eighth Amendment. The problem is that they've received the Hammonds cruel and unusual punishment, and the judge tried to adjudicate that and could not. And so we can blame the court, but this is a law that we have caused. We can fix this. And you can disagree with their methods of protesting, but frankly, we wouldn't be talking about this today if they weren't protesting. And so they've drawn attention to it. I hope we do fix it. We could fix this next week. The Senate could fix it probably a week later, and the president could sign it.
Thank you. Very back, yeah.
Matt Fuller with Huffington Post. A recent poll has Paul Ryan's approval rating, or his favorability rating, at 46%, which is down from that same poll on November 7th from 69%. I'm just wondering if you think, basically, is it fair for voters to already be frustrated with the new speaker, and are you guys already frustrated with the new speaker?
It's always fair. And he has a year to make those poll numbers go up. I mean, I don't think, I think I've said this a million times, it's too early to judge the speakership of Paul Ryan. And I think it's actually fundamentally unfair to try to judge the speakership of Paul Ryan over the last month or so. But as I have also said, the honeymoon's over. And I think he needs to start putting up real conservative reform in the House and doing the things that are necessary to show the voters that he is a different speaker than John Boehner, because frankly, everything he has done so far is no different than what John Boehner would have done. And I think that's why you see that reflected in the poll numbers. But now it's time for, I do think he's got a year to make that up. And I think we all want to give him that opportunity to make it up. Let me add a point. Initially, I think there was a honeymoon period. And as with any honeymoon period, things start getting to normal. So I would submit that that is a part of the reason for the decline in his favorability and an increase in his unfavorability. Then you've got what the Democrats typically do, and that's to try to demonize Republican speakers in order to make that person a figurehead for why the Democrats need to gain control. And in fairness to the Democrats, Republicans tried to make sure that the American people were dissatisfied with Nancy Pelosi, predecessor to John Boehner. And so Paul Ryan is going to be that figurehead for everything that goes wrong in the House of Representatives because he is the Speaker of the House. At the same time, though, on a public policy level, our deficits and debt are a major threat to the solvency of the United States of America. In my personal opinion, with the economics background I have, I think a very compelling case can be made that it's only a matter of time now before America suffers a debilitating insolvency and bankruptcy. And for 4 or 5 years, while we weren't doing what needed to be done to minimize the risk of that insolvency and bankruptcy, we at least made improvements. Every single year since 2010, when the Republicans captured the House of Representatives, the deficit had declined from $1.4 trillion to a low of $439 billion. So while we weren't doing what needed to be done, we were improving the situation. However, with what has happened, particularly last month with the omnibus bill, I think a good case can be made that this Congress, led by Mitch McConnell and now Paul Ryan, and they're going to catch the barbs because of that, this Congress will be the first since the Republicans captured the House where the deficit situation gets worse. Instead of making things better, we're now making things worse. And if you look at the first 2 months of this fiscal year, as a data point, our deficit is $23 billion worse after the first 2 months of this fiscal year than the preceding fiscal year. And I think you're probably looking at, instead of a $439 billion deficit, which is what we suffered during the last fiscal year, something that will be in the neighborhood of $450 to $500 billion, maybe worse depending on how the economy goes, because the economy to a large degree impacts our deficit situation. And so there's great dissatisfaction with the American people because they understand the threat of this insolvency and bankruptcy in the context of what we've seen in Greece, in the context of what we're seeing today in Puerto Rico, in the context of what has happened in a lot of other countries around the globe who have similarly had financially irresponsible leadership in their governmental levels.
Matt, the short answer to your question is it's too early to tell. But here's the yardstick that we need to use to grade this speaker. We've got one job this year at the end of the day, one job, and that is to fund the government in a responsible, thoughtful, and constitutional manner through a process. If we are here January of next year or December of next year, having just passed an omnibus or looking at an omnibus, that is an F-, okay? If we pass 12 appropriations bills and stand our ground and force the Senate to face these issues, that's an A. And there you have it.
We'll come right here. Here you go. I'm sorry, right here in the back, next to back row.
Thanks. Marian Bax from the Huffington Post. I was wondering, in light of the debt, how do you feel about shifting to a territorial tax system, and what rate would you like to see for repatriated money? Donald Trump, I think, has floated something like 10 to 15%. President Obama has floated something like 19%.
Give us a little refresher on your territorial term there. Territorial tax, you mean a corporate tax rate reduction?
Corporate tax rates. So right now,
Yeah.
corporations.
Yeah. Yep.
Documenting tax havens.
Yep.
And a lot of corporations are saying, well, you allow us to come back here.
Right.
With more tax rates, then we'd like to have that money come back.
Right. No, that's a low-hanging fruit. Hopefully we make progress on that. If we don't, the American people scratch their head. Most every economist says, and this, if you all want to report on this, this would be helpful to help Bernie Sanders understand a little economics better. Most every economic study over the years says that a corporate rate reduction is probably the best stimulus measure you can have for the economy. And, but more important for my leftist friends, and I have them, it's also the best way to help the distribution of income for the poor, right? You don't just assert that the minimum wage should be higher, right? Everybody knows intuitively you cannot make everyone on the earth make $100 an hour. You all get that, right? So just answer the question, why can't you do that? That's the answer to the question. The way you can help the poor is to change our K-12 education system and make our kids globally competitive. That's not happening in any major city that I'm aware of. And secondly, increase their productivity. And the way you increase their productivity is to make firms the only place where you can earn an income, right? I mean, the government is funded by firms. Everything comes out of firm activity. This is not taught in K-12. And so the corporate rate reduction is huge, and then it's politically tough to do because if you give corporations a tax reduction, then individuals want it as well, and that's what makes it politically more challenging, right? If you do corporate rate, then you got to do the C Corp and then the S Corp, and then the S Corp are individuals, and then other individuals want a marginal rate reduction, and so that makes it politically hard. But we have some low-hanging fruit, and the corporate rate reduction is tied to all these corporate inversions. Burger King leaving, Budweiser, the horses are now over in Europe, and it's a depressing thing, right? So our college kids coming out of college have less firms to employ them. We need to bring them back. Our corporate rate is 39% all in. Ireland's, I think, is 15%. And so it's very attractive. I think Pfizer just left. They did an inversion a few weeks ago, and on and on and on. In the United States of America, the home of free markets.
Look, I've said this before. This just underscores you need a whole new tax code. Everyone knows the tax code is broken. I always use this comparison. Any tax code on the personal side which says to half the population you don't have to participate in the main tax is broken. Any tax code on the corporate side which says to American companies you're going to have to pay the highest rate in the world is stupid. So if you have a tax code that's broken and stupid, you might want to change it, right? So everyone gets that. I think our task this year, obviously in the broad sense, it's to defend the Constitution, as I think Thomas and others have talked about. But this year is to show there's a difference. You know, of course the president's going to say bad things about Republicans. That doesn't surprise me. He's been doing that for a long time. What we need to show is we're different than the Democrats. And right now our voters want to see us actually put forward a bold tax reform plan that radically changes the code and throws out the current one we have. Put forward our alternative to Obamacare that shows how we would do a patient-centered model. Put forward our welfare reform plan. Things that the speaker has talked about doing. We need to do those and show there's a difference. And then, frankly, we need to also show the voters what we told them we were going to do, which is hold people accountable who have positions of public trust who do things wrong. One of the reasons people are frustrated by what they see happening to the individuals in Oregon that Raúl and Steve talked about is because they see the Hammonds going to jail for 5 years and they see Lois Lerner going free, right? So we have put forward we should hold John Koskinen accountable for the terrible things done at the IRS. We've started an impeachment resolution that we've introduced. I think our voters want to see us follow through with that kind of thing and actually hold Mr. Koskinen accountable for the wrongdoing that took place at the Internal Revenue Service. To me, that's what this year is about, showing how we're different in those big policy areas and holding people accountable who do wrong things in government.
And I suggest that the tax rate ought to be zero, and here's why. Let's say that you're working over in Paris, France for 5 years. You're an American citizen. You work hard. You pay all of the taxes that are owed in Paris to the Paris government and to the French government. And then let's say it's just to use a round number, it's $100,000 a year that you're able to earn for 5 years. What moral authority does the United States of America have to tell you and American citizens that before you can come back to the United States of America, you have to pay income tax on $500,000 that you earned when you've already paid those taxes in France? What moral authority does the United States of America have to do that? And I would submit that there is none for work and services performed in other parts of the planet. Yes, if it's earned here in the United States of America, you can have a moral case for why there should be those taxes that are required and that are paid. Now, from a purely economic standpoint, what benefit does the United States of America have from a zero tax rate for the money that is earned by that American citizen over in Paris, France? When he comes back, or she as the case may be, and brings that money here, that becomes a part of our economy, that it generates economic activity, which in turn generates taxes long term. So when the money comes back, you still have a positive cash flow with the federal government with the income tax rate, because now you have economic activity that is flowing from the money that has been brought back. And just as we ought to treat that American citizen who's been in Paris, France a certain way, we ought to treat every other American entity that is earning money in other parts of the globe doing work and paying taxes as required in those countries and localities. We ought to treat them in the exact same way.
I think that one of the things that's interesting about this debate is if you follow what's happened with the pharmaceutical companies, from a shareholder standpoint, it became inevitable that they would do that which they did. And so, you know, I'd sort of measure in two political realities. One is that change occurs from a burning platform, and two, that change is incremental in the world of politics. I think on the first point, we now have that burning platform, which we've not had in the past. You know, I think that what's happened with the drug companies, the pharmaceuticals, is simply the bellwether of much greater changes to come in corporate world if nothing's changed. And I think it's, as we all know, it's been a clear goal of Speaker Ryan's to bring about a change within the corporate tax system. So I think something's going to happen. I can't imagine picking the rate. I think it'll be tied to, you know, whatever is in the world of possibility, and I apologize, whatever's in the world of possibility. But again, I think it has much bigger implications what Pfizer did than people realize. I would secondly go back to, John, your comment a moment ago on, you know, was what the president did with regard to the Second Amendment about vilification of Republicans. I would argue no, it really wasn't. It was sort of the opening salvo in a debate that you all will probably cover this year on government shutdown. I think it was really about a political building block of saying, let's start out the blocks finding something we can disagree on. I mean, he had the votes in 2013 in a democratically controlled Senate. He couldn't pull it off then, and yet that's going to be his opening salvo. I think it was about lining up something to fight on as we go into this appropriation cycle.
All right, we're going to come here, and then I'll come up to the front. Right here.
Elena Platt with National Review. Can you guys talk a bit about what conservatives are hoping to bring to the table in Baltimore next week, and I guess probably more specifically what you're hoping to accomplish?
I hope we do what I just described, actually have a tax reform legislation that we vote on, not just talk about, actually vote on and say, here's how we're going to dramatically change the tax code in a way that's going to help middle-class families get better job opportunities, get better chance for higher growth and everything else that we need in our economy. How we're going to reform welfare to help people trapped in the systems, focus on work to get them. So show our alternative, how we would, and this is where I think the speaker has been very good, showing how we would take the country in a different direction than Obama and Clinton want to take it. And he's talked about those three examples I gave: tax reform, welfare reform, and healthcare reform. And I think we should actually not just talk about them, but pass legislation and say, here's what we're for. And then when we have a Republican president, the model we all like to look back at is when Reagan came into office, he had promised to do things on the tax code. And what did he do? He looked at the tax plan Jack Kemp had passed or had put forward and said, let's make that as our base model. We'll tweak it some and change it some. But we actually got major tax reform. So I think that's the model, but you can't have that model work if you don't pass things in the House at least that says, here's where we want to go. And then I do think our voters elected us to do what I just described, and I do think they elected us to hold public officials accountable who do wrong things. And we have to do that. We have to. John Koskinen was commissioner of the IRS with 3 preservation orders in place, 2 subpoenas in place, and allowed backup tapes to be destroyed containing 24,000 emails, many of which were most likely Lois Lerner emails. I think someone who's presiding over an agency of that power and that clout, when those things happen, should have to face the music. So I think that's what should be a big part of our agenda as we move forward.
We'll come right up here to the very front row and then the gentleman behind.
Right. I'm Susan Cornwell with Reuters. This is a follow-up on Congressman Labrador's comment when you said you'd like to see Ryan bring up some real conservative reforms in the House. I was just wondering what you in particular had in mind. If I can throw in one more question, I wonder if there's anybody up there who doesn't plan to go to the Republican retreat next week, because I think in the, okay, there's two, because I think in the past some of you haven't gone, and I don't know, maybe you want to elaborate on why you're not going, but anyway.
Well, I'll quickly elaborate why I'm not going. I've got 2 daughters who are 8 months pregnant, and my father-in-law has passed, and my wife is responsible for the estate in South Carolina, and I have family duties.
I would be there, save for the fact that the Republican presidential debate is taking place in my home city.
I think it's a lot of the things that Jim has already touched on, but I think even broader than that, being a conservative leader is not about giving conservative speeches. It's about actually instituting and passing conservative policy. And I think that's what the Republican Party, that's the dissonance that the Republican Party has right now, that they're really good at going out and campaigning on conservative issues, giving conservative speeches, but when the rubber meets the road and it's time to actually pass legislation and to fight for something, they're unwilling to do that because they're afraid of their own shadow. So the question is, will Ryan just be a good speech maker or a good policy maker? So far, he's shown that he's a great speech maker. And he says things that I wish I could say. He says them in a way that I wish I could say them. But the question is not just can you deliver the speech, but can you deliver on the substance? And that's really what we need to show as a conservative party. And the question is whether the Republican Party is a conservative party or not. I'm afraid that so far we have shown that we're not a conservative party. I think there's too many people here in Washington, D.C. that are afraid of fighting for conservative policy, that are afraid of doing the things that are necessary to move the ball in a conservative way. You look at what Nancy Pelosi did. Whatever you think about, you can blame her for losing the House and the Senate, but guess what? She instituted policies that she wanted that are probably going to be in place for a long, long time, that Democrats have been wanting to institute for at least 100 years. That's what a leader of your party does. She knew how to do it. I haven't seen a Republican leader know how to do it on our side. They know how to give conservative speeches, but can they actually move the ball in a direction that is going to bring the debt down? I think what Mo Brooks talked about a long time ago is probably one of the most disappointing things about last year. For 5 years, I've been able to go back to my district and say that at a minimum, I made a difference because the deficit had gone down. Well, guess what, folks? It's not going to go down from this moment on unless we do something completely different than we have been doing. And I just don't see the willingness in the Republican Party to do that. So that's really the key. Are we really a transformational conservative party, or are we just a party that's just a little bit better than the Democratic Party, that will just spend a little bit less than the Democrats? And that's not what I signed up to be or to do.
All right, the gentleman right here in the second row.
Thank you. I'm Ryan Rainey from Morning Consult. I know some of you voted for TPA, some of you did not vote for TPA. You may have seen this week there are a number of industry groups like the Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers that have backed TPP. I wanted to see if any of you think that that might nudge the vote count on TPP if it comes up at all in this session, and also if you think that, or if you've gotten any indication from the leadership on when the agreement might come to the floor. Thank you.
Well, as you know, we're still waiting for the 90 days to pass before it actually can be submitted to Congress. I will say I'm about 5,000 pages away from finishing reading the document, and I think most groups are the same way. But inside the House, I haven't heard anything that would come. I mean, you've seen the public statements from the Senate Majority Leader about that. That wouldn't happen before the election. I presume that is the case. But to do our due diligence and to look closely at the 100 requirements we placed on the president and to see whether those are in there, I have a long ways to go, and I think my colleagues are in the same boat. And we were very clear, very on numerous things, and I've yet to see for sure whether the president's negotiators actually achieve those clear objectives.
All right, we'll take one final question. We'll go back to the corner. I haven't gotten back there yet. We'll go to the very back. Thank you.
Yeah, Stuart Rosenblatt, Executive Intelligence Review. It's a bill that Mr. Massey is a co-sponsor of with Congressman Walter Jones and Steve Lynch. It's to declassify the original last chapter of the 9/11 report, which has been classified from the American public for a dozen years. What this last chapter purports to do is lay the blame at the foot of Saudi Arabia for both helping to orchestrate.
We're running. Can you just pose your question?
But the question is, would members here join with Mr. Massey and Mr. in declassifying the last chapter?
I'll just address that briefly. Hopefully that question will be asked in a presidential debate, because it's completely up to the president whether those 28 pages are released or not. Our resolution encourages him to release the 28 pages, but it is essential, particularly in the context of the debate of what we're going to do in Syria and what we're going to do in the Middle East and how we're going to combat terrorism and who are our friends and who are our enemies over there. It's essential that the people have the information in those 28 pages.
All right, we'll have that be our final comment. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you back here in February. Thank you.